see. I wanted to, well, hi everyone, my name is Mako Nagasawa, and I wanted to make a pitch based on the topic of the plenary session from this morning to keep an eye out for this book. There's some postcards over at the IDP desk, and this is a friend of mine, Sheila Wise Rowe, who is a wonderful counselor and located in Boston, and she wrote a book called Healing Racial Trauma, and it's a collection of, each chapter is written by someone with a very different personal and family experience related to racial trauma. I got to contribute a chapter, but also I've read some of the other chapters too, and they are wonderful. So if you're wondering, what can you do to keep growing in the direction of today's plenary, there's that. So I am the director of a Christian ed and curriculum development organization called the Anastasis Center. Anastasis is the Greek word for resurrection, and for Christian education and ministry. And Kat, can you wave your hand? Kat is also has consulted me and serves as a graphic design expert for our small little team. I want to put a tool in your hand and encourage you to think about taking this back to your churches, your communities, workplaces, organizations, and it's called a long repentance. And it's basically a free online resource made up of short blog posts with a study guide for small group discussion and personal reflection. And I'm going to talk about how it's been used so far, because I have a hope that it will be used in all 50 states by the time the 2020 election rolls around, and maybe even if we can figure out ways to count political districts, like how to do that. So the theme of it is how Christian mistakes and really Christian heresies play a role in our modern racial and political climate. And what I'm going to do is kind of take some highlights from it and show you a little bit of how it's been used and get you interested enough, I hope, that you would take a postcard and think about using it and keeping in touch with me and Kat and others on the team. Okay, so this feedback comes from an Anglican church in Indianapolis who it's led by I think it's a congregation of about 100, led by two co-pastors named Matt and Ben. They say this: we led our church through a long repentance during Lent last year and experienced deep conversation and increased understanding of how our American history and culture is steeped in racialized stigma and prejudice. Wide-ranging without being unruly, Sangwan and Mako, and Sang is my colleague, touch on key aspects of how the formation of the American consciousness is rooted in meritocracy in every aspect of our society, and wrongly so. Written in a conversational format, A Long Repentance succeeds in being accessible and comprehensive, understandable and deeply profound. We highly recommend this resource to educate and expand imaginations on what God's justice looks like in every facet of our culture. Part of the hope of our organization is to talk about Christian restorative justice and healing atonement, especially because there's this great convergence happening between the world of biblical studies and practical criminal justice around restorative justice, so people are understanding what that is, in contrast with retributive justice. And what we do is we bring out the gems from the early church, the pre-colonial church, Africa, Asia, Europe, in order to show that actually it was colonialism that distorted Christian teaching. And that's important because if everything that we're doing has never been taught before, that raises some real questions, right? Like, what are we doing then? Like, was there ever really hope in the church that the gospel was really impacting societies and cultures before? Are we playing with words? What are we doing? So the graphic is here because we chose this because it depicts kind of a long road up a mountain where you don't exactly know where you're going, right? And racial and political, discourse is like that. But we have a hope that when you get higher and higher, you see more, and it becomes more beautiful. And that's been our experience. So if you want to show how, and here's some things that the curriculum, the goals of the curriculum are. If you want to show how race, chosen people, mythology, that's a big one, theocracy, and meritocracy are Christian heresies. They are Christian heresies. Then please read this. It's like, it's easy, we take the best of academic stuff and distill it down. They're put in dialogue form between like two white pastors and then two co-workers, one of whom is a black male and a white female, and they're talking about these things, both on the level of politics and faith. And what happens, I think, is that when I say that these things are heresies, they're not just issues of justice, although sure, they're issues of justice and injustice. What that does is it puts it into another category. And you bypass a whole bunch of, I'll just say, right-wing Christian concern that you're just bending the knee to secularism, right? Or you're being a cultural Marxist. Or all of the names that you get thrown when you start talking like this, it just bypasses all of it. And you start to understand how to decode dog whistles in our politics, because a lot of things reference these heresies, but in polite talk. If you are interested in showing how injustices in our housing, education, and criminal justice systems are the result of these Christian heresies, I think you'd be interested in this. If you want to understand how the pre-colonial church got a lot of things right, not everything, I'm not saying that I would agree with everything, but they got a lot of things right about people, culture, slavery, land, justice. It is inspiring. And so you get to see church history and U.S. history in a deeper way, along lines that typically we are not taught. And if you want to see how Jesus, his teaching and his story serve the public good, I think you'd be inspired by this. So, have I got you a little interested? Yeah. Okay, good. So, post number one, I'll just start as an example with this. It starts with a contrast between John Winthrop and Roger Williams. Why two white men? Well, partly because these two individuals represent two debates, or two positions in a debate that is still happening. Like, it's happening now. And so we want to understand that. Secondly, I think we do want to highlight Roger Williams because, especially for our white American Christian brothers and sisters, it is really helpful to see that there was an anchor point at one point in time. And if we had gone in this direction, this country would be entirely different. And completely different. So let me just summarize their positions and why they're what they are and why this debate continues to echo today. John Winthrop was one of the founders, one of the first governors of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He advocated for Puritan theocracy. He, what was it, stands towards heretics, quote, heretics, or anyone not Puritan, right? Exile or execution. He did both. He held 3 Pequot slaves personally. So that gives you his indication of his position on slavery. He believed that Native Americans were savages, called them that. Believed that conversion entailed adopting English Puritan culture, and believed that God gave the English Puritans the land, right? And bear in mind, well, anyway, I won't go into that. So here's the contrast. Roger Williams believed in human rights without theocracy. He's the founder of what we would call the First Amendment, freedom of religious conscience. How do we see that? Because he welcomed the heretics into Providence. And he said, you don't have to believe what I believe. He was a Christian, helped found the First Baptist Church in North America, and but also believed that people should have the freedom of religious conscience, even cutting in to a marriage. So this particular law or a trial is called Joshua Varon versus Providence, 1638. Joshua Varon was a man who was suing Providence and Roger Williams and his wife, Jane, because he did not want to attend the Baptist services that Roger Williams had set up. And they were across the street from his home. Jane, his wife, did. So she went. And he sued Providence. Okay, he said, like, you're coming between my marriage. So you want to talk about like women's rights? So Roger Williams and the town council said, nope, freedom of religious conscience trumps your marriage. So she is free to do that. Amazing precedent. Freedom of religious conscience, like it's huge to us. By the way, that is what every church theologian taught before Augustine. Story for another time.
Is that part of the
Roger Williams abolished slavery, chattel slavery. So he was the first colonial abolitionist, and imprisonment for debt. Huge. He admired Native American culture. He wrote a book about it that became the best-selling book. He became, for a time, the expert in the English-speaking world because he wrote an encyclopedia about like Native American knowledge, culture, and languages. It was called A Key to the American Languages. And he did that because he was a missionary and a linguist, and he wanted to honor and respect Native culture and share Jesus without sharing English culture or forcing them to convert to English culture as well. Amazing. And he bought land fairly. He befriended people, honored treaties, and all these things. So two very different trajectories right at the start of this country. What would have happened had we followed down Roger Williams' path? Right? And where he learned this and how he understood it, that's also really worth exploring, because he was not unique, right, in church history. So here's a sample of the dialogue that we put in the mouths of two white pastors debating, like how to reach out to Native Americans and whether that's relevant. So Bill says, you chose John Winthrop, so do the majority of white evangelicals. I think we should all choose Roger Williams instead. How so? Asked Eric. John Winthrop wanted a white Protestant nation and landed in Christian heresy. Roger Williams did not. Right? And it's just a sample, and some of the example questions, or an example question would be, what would it mean today if Winthrop was wrong and Williams was right? What would it mean? Okay, here's post number 4. We summarize a book by Willie James Jennings, African-American scholar, theologian, amazing guy. He writes a book called The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. It tells the story of a Jesuit missionary named Jose de Costa, who's, I believe, Spanish or Portuguese, who was one of the first contacts, right, with the Americas. And he was actually a world traveler, and he recommended the forced conversion of Africans. And so Jennings says, we went at one point from faith-seeking understanding to faith-judging intelligence. So this guy, De Costa, was saying that we can divide the world really into 3 racial and cultural and intelligence groupings. And, there was a hierarchy. Basically, it followed Caucasian, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, and that language passed into Enlightenment science because they quoted him. So this guy was really important. And anyway, so it was really destructive. Jennings says, human identity was no longer conceived in relationship to their land, right? We used to say things like Jesus of Nazareth. Like, there's a place name. That's how we know people, or that's a big part of how we know people. Augustine of Hippo, or things like that. But now, identity was in relationship to white European self-identity, and including our estimation of our intelligence and white bodies. And so an example question that goes along with this post is, are Christians complicit in racism, or are they directly causally responsible for it? Race did not exist prior to colonialism. And so when we talk about, Christians are complicit, yeah, sure, but I mean, as far as who we are today, but in terms of historically, we are directly causally responsible. And that gives us a different impetus and motivation to tackle some of these issues. Post number 5, prior to colonialism, Christians everywhere, African, Asian, European theologians believed God gave land to humanity in common as a gift. So here is John Chrysostom of Constantinople, one of the most celebrated and revered figures in the Orthodox and Catholic Church. He was Bishop of Constantinople until he drove the Emperor and Empress nuts because he preached so often against greed and the wealthy. and so they took him on a forced march where he died. He said this, "Are not the earth and the fullness thereof the Lord's? If therefore our possessions are the common gift of the Lord, they belong also to our fellows. For all the things of the Lord are common." And then Thomas Aquinas, probably one of the greatest, most influential Catholic scholars, said, "In cases of need, all things are common property. There is no sin in taking private property when need has made it common." So all the images we had of looters during Hurricane Katrina, what is that? What do we think about? Is that looting, or is that just surviving because there is no sin in taking private property when need has made it common? Right? That's not theft. That's okay. That's actually sanctioned. That we bless that. But John Locke, one of the most influential philosopher on the American Founding Fathers and the Constitution, believed you could take others' land if you were more productive than them. So a quote from the post, "Locke intentionally misrepresented Native Americans." He had books about Native Americans in his personal library, which he ignored in order to portray them as lazy. Right? They didn't develop the land. They never developed land. But why did he do this? Because he was invested in this idea that meritocracy gives you the ability to displace someone else from their land. He watched the Protestant crown in England seize land from Catholic monasteries on the grounds that it wasn't productive. And he turns that against the Native Americans. You're not being productive. So one of the example questions is this why Americans fear smarter immigrants or people of color? Have a culture of workaholism? Believe America is a meritocracy when it isn't? Because this is part of our founding myth. We almost have to believe this kind of stuff. And this is why meritocracy is actually a Christian heresy. No one taught Genesis 1 like John Locke before him. It's a heresy. We should teach college students about this, right? Christians and Native American culture agreed about the land prior to colonialism. Okay, post 6 through 14 talk about the history of residential discrimination in housing through the government, affirmative action for white people to move out to the suburbs by subsidizing home loans. It's put in the framework of a dialogue. The illusion of meritocracy in schooling and policing, because once you have residential segregation, everything else follows. Differential property tax valuations and therefore different levels of resources for local schools, and then different experiences of policing and criminal justice in your own zip code. And then we close with restorative justice over meritocratic retributive, why that is a theological issue that secular thinking cannot state. There is no basis for saying that in secular thinking, even though, some would want to say that. So again, there's a faith component to this as well. And then restorative justice in housing. Why is it that housing first works, and yet, generally speaking, we regard the housing market as a reward economy and not a gift economy? God thought of housing as a gift, right? Hey, here's the Garden of Eden, here's the whole creation, I'm going to put you there. You haven't done anything, I'm going to just give you housing. So, and that story continues, right, through Israel, the Jubilee principle. I'm going to reset the land ownership. So you're all my kids. You get the land. You don't get to pass down advantages and disadvantages to your children and grandchildren. Not on the issue of land. So, I mean, restorative justice in a broad Christian sense, that's what we're shooting for and talking about here. Here's an example, post number 7. In the dialogue, the black man says to the white woman, that single house, he goes through this basically a very personalized family budget and kind of story comparing his family and her family. And at the end says, that single house could easily be making $1 million difference in the life of your family compared to mine. Generations later, wealth leveraged by home ownership is still the #1 reason why white people have so much wealth and black people do not. And you've seen the charts, I'm sure. So an example question, describe the differences between the two family experiences. Right? So for people to read this and they can kind of trace it through, take it in, internalize it. And how does this square with the 14th Amendment? Right? Because the 14th Amendment is equal treatment under the law. It's actually the most biblical principle in the Constitution. Equal treatment under the law. And our system of residential discrimination was carried out at all levels by government agencies. It wasn't just the private market. So if we're talking like Ta-Nehisi Coates about housing reparations, that's the place he starts, and I think it's starting to. Post number 8 deals with schooling and differential finances, and here's a blurb. If you think school finances don't matter that much, you must be willing to do 2 things. First, you must be perfectly willing to send your own children to a less financially resourced school. Right? Because one of the pushbacks from the right or from people who don't want to change the system is, but you're making this all about money. What about leadership? What about the culture of families? And, well, okay, but if you think that money has no impact, then you must be willing to do these 2 things. Right? Send your kids there. And second, you must be willing to shift money, believing that the shift will have little to no effect. Yes. So why do you even bring that up? So the example question coming out of this. Joseph cared for little ones in Egypt. Egyptian little ones, not just Israelite ones. Daniel for all the poor in Babylon, and Esther for the Jewish minority in Persia. At the height of Israel's greatest political influence among the nations, there's a concern for the well-being of children and the vulnerable. How does that pattern impact how we approach child development today? Right? This is the people of God at that time in the highest levels of influence among the Gentile nations. How are we called to steward power? One of again, the reasons why we developed this curriculum is I've seen many examples of what I would call incarnational care for the poor, including myself. I'm an Asian American raised in the suburbs, moved into a tougher community in Boston. And I don't think that's for everyone. I don't think we can all do that. That would contribute to massive gentrification. But I do think then what we have to think about institutional care for the poor. And so we're thinking about specific policy changes, again, ahead of these elections. Post 14, here, this is going to be touchy. Calvinism and divine meritocratic retributive justice. Calvin believed, he made the theological shift going from God's justice is not restorative, it is retributive. Like in theory, we could all earn our way to God. None of us do that, and so Jesus takes the retributive punishment at the cross. Okay, so that's Calvin. That had a social impact because in general, Christians are called to imitate God. So if God treats people that way, then how should we do that? So everywhere Calvinism goes, increased punitive sentencing follows. Okay, there's scholarship on that. Calvin believed that you prove your salvation by working for low wages. For low wages. And Calvinism abolished almsgiving. If you want to see not compassionate conservatism, but contemptuous conservatism, there's some scholarship here. There's a quote from a book on that is generally favorable to Calvin. Giving alms is no charity, is a slogan, in contrast or even deliberate opposition to the medieval ethics of good works through giving alms. Hostility to public aid is a specifically English-American attribute that other Protestant societies do not share. Once again, just look at the influence of the church in other countries, in other modes, or in other denominational traditions, right? Like, it doesn't sound like this. It doesn't look like this. Why do we have this here? Well, it's because, example question, how do you process Calvinism's contribution to making meritocratic retributive justice higher than restorative justice?
Where's that quote?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I could show you, I could call up the blog post later and click on the footnote. It's right there. Okay, another pastor in the ELCA, Lutheran tradition, says, I really like the succinct timeline on white affirmative action through big government policy post-World War II and the theological conversation around the economy and restorative justice. Why? Because I think there's a tendency for, again, a lot of Americans, especially white evangelicals, to believe that people who are wealthy pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, and so people who are poor are that way because they failed somehow. Not because there's systemic racism or things like that that they want to look at. We just dismantle that and point out that meritocracy itself is a heresy. And the enshrining of meritocratic justice over restorative justice is heretical. That's the argument that we're making. And so it's fun. So, once again, if you want to show how race, chosen people mythology, right, like we are the city on the hill, not the church across the world, but specifically American exceptionalism, is that's the chosen people mythology. Why do we always have to be so special? Theocracy, meritocracy are Christian heresies. If you want to show how injustices in housing, education, and criminal justice are the result of Christian heresies, you want to show how the pre-colonial church, African, Asian, European, got a lot of things right, and show that Jesus and his teaching and his story serve the public good. And I have had a couple of non-Christian acquaintances read through a few of these and just give me feedback on them. They're like, this is really interesting. And this gives me a different perspective circling on evangelicalism. So check this out, please. It's free online. Just pick up as many postcards as you would like, because they're heavy and I don't want to take them back. They're 15 blog posts. Each post is about a 10-minute read, so people have used it in a small group context. You can read it beforehand, but you don't have to. And there's a study guide online as well. Part 2 is coming soon. Topics include how the heresy of slavery fueled American gun culture, lack of labor rights, white male sexual entitlement, and government dysfunction, and so on. So please, friends, let's keep in touch. I'll take a few Q&A, and then we'll turn it over to Jay. Yes?
If you go back to the slide where it said white affirmative action, government policy.
Yes.
I sense where you're going with that. People don't understand that affirmative action, actually, the initial, were actually benefiting certain people, with people of color.
Yeah,
So can you kind of just quickly unpack that?
right. I think, I forget exactly, I think it was $120 billion were spent subsidizing home loans for white Americans in the middle class by 1968. So by the time 1968 rolls around and the Fair Housing Act is passed, you could say that white America had a $120 billion head start. It was funded by taxpayers, right? So minorities were paying their taxes and reaping none of the benefits of any of that program, including black veterans of World War II. Right? It's just astounding. And so that's the biggest single thing that I'm talking about here. It was an affirmative action program, the likes of which we have never seen. And yet it's like this hidden welfare system. People think, oh yeah, I just qualified for that loan because I have a good credit score. So that's the type of thing that we have to dismantle succinctly and quickly. Is that the myth of small government. We've never had a small government. We've always had a warfare government that partnered with big corporations after World War II to send American manufacturing all over the world, right, to provide jobs on a discriminatory basis and provide health care through jobs, knowing that black folks, brown folks would never be employed by these major corporations. So all of this is a hidden welfare system. It's what Chris Ladd, who writes for Forbes magazine, calls white socialism. All right, so if you're poor white or not white, then you get a brutal meritocracy. So that's the affirmative action. Yes?
I'm just curious, you showed this to some non-Christian friends, like, how did it help them? They probably already hate evangelicals.
I don't think that they care that much. I mean, I should find some that really do hate evangelicals and kind of run as my little experiment. My particular friends weren't that political.
How did they find it interesting then? Just all the content?
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the author's name that you mentioned just not Chris what?
Chris Ladd, L-A-D-D, for Forbes magazine. He's really good at understanding the hidden welfare system. Yes?
What was the impetus for you to follow this and get this started?
This particular curriculum?
Yeah.
Because, well, it is what I genuinely believe. I'm also a history buff, and it bugs me that we do things like we don't know church history, and so we think in American history like the colonists and the founders were just people of their time when it comes to slavery, for instance. Actually, they were not. They knew they were going backwards in time because England had abolished slavery through church decree in 1102. That's why in 1772, when the Somerset case came before London, because an enslaved African man stepped off a ship and set his foot on English soil, he was eligible to be free. That was the law. And that rippled through the American colonies, and people thought, oh no, the British Empire is going to abolish slavery. So we have to rebel soon. We are taught that the American Revolution is about the pursuit of liberty or taxation without representation is unfair. No, it was a conservative movement to preserve slavery.
Right.
Right, and so you could say that these were heretics looking for a safe space to practice their heresy. Once you start seeing that, and you see that, oh, actually, there were Christians who abolished slavery when they could in these forms, then it's a game changer. And so I have felt like, okay, you either defend Jesus and at least some part of church history, or you defend the United States in every dimension. Like you come up with flimsy excuses that are not historical and not biblical either, but you have to choose. Yes.
A question, so in the different contexts that people have used this study, have you seen a difference in how it's received in predominantly like white circles and in like non-dominant contexts? Like, can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, honestly, I don't have that much data. I have my circle of friends, and then some other churches who, in Indianapolis, it's fairly diverse. But I haven't been out there to talk to them or meet them face to face. And then that is the only church that has used it as a official small group curriculum. What they have said is because there's a few different angles. Because they're Anglican, they were interested in the church history piece. It helps them to know, because Anglicans are more interested in tradition. So to honor church tradition like that was helpful. It's diverse but fairly educated, a diverse crowd on the education level. Socioeconomically and in terms of diverse education level, I don't yet have that kind of formal stories or feedback. So I think if what my circle of friends have told me, it's been pretty helpful, including the folks in my own church, which is kind of in the less educated bracket, and we were thinking a lot about the housing piece in particular.
Where is the church?
Dorchester, in Boston.
Just a practical question, do they have this book at
It's not a book.
Oh.
It's just online. So it's a series of blog posts.
That's good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, thanks, friends. Please come up and.